Heat, not just the warmth of late summer, but a different heat, the kind that rises under the surface when history starts to boil. On September 1st, 1939, as dawn broke over Europe, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Villages woke up to the sound of engines, boots, and artillery. To the world, it looked like the beginning of something terrible. But emotionally, spiritually, historically, World War II didn't start that morning. It was the moment a bomb finally exploded. The fuse had been burning for 20 years. To understand what really started the Second World War, you have to go back to exhausted faces, empty tables, and a generation that thought it had already seen the worst humanity could do. November 1918. The guns of World War I finally fell silent. Millions were dead. Empires had collapsed. The German army retreated home in stunned disbelief. They had not watched their flag lowered in Berlin. There was no enemy marching through their capital. To many soldiers, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like interruption. But in the rail car at Compiègne, an armistice was signed. Germany's leaders agreed to stop fighting. The Kaiser fled into exile. And a dangerous story began to take root. A story that would quietly poison the hearts of millions. It whispered, "We were not defeated by the enemy. We were betrayed by politicians, by cowards, by people who signed papers while we bled." This story, the stab in the back myth, became the emotional core of the next war. Not tanks, not planes. A story. Then came the Treaty of Versailles. On paper, it was peace. In reality, it was humiliation written into law. Germany lost land, lost colonies, lost its pride. It was forced to accept war guilt, as if a whole people had personally chosen catastrophe. And on top of that, reparations. Impossible, crushing debts to Britain and France, to a starving mother staring at an empty plate, to a father who had left part of himself in the trenches, to a child asking why their money could not buy bread. Versailles did not feel like justice. It felt like punishment. And punishment rarely creates peace. It creates resentment. Quiet, patient resentment. Across Europe, new countries were born from the map's reshaping. Poland reappeared. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states. It looked like freedom, but many of these borders sliced through old communities. Millions of ethnic Germans now lived outside Germany. Seeds of future conflict were planted inside the very peace that was supposed to prevent it. Meanwhile, the United States, whose president had dreamed of a new world order, simply went home. Congress refused to join the League of Nations. America turned inward. A world that had just survived its worst war voluntarily weakened the only institution meant to prevent the next one. The First World War ended in exhaustion. The Second World War began in disappointment, bitterness, and unfinished grief. And in the middle of all that stood a fragile experiment, German democracy. The new Germany was called the Weimar Republic. No Kaiser, no emperor, just parliaments, parties, elections. On paper, it was progress. In reality, it was a wounded giant trying to stand on broken legs. It inherited all the guilt, all the debt, all the anger. On the streets, paramilitary groups fought for control. Far-right nationalists claimed Germany had been humiliated by traitors. Far-left revolutionaries promised a communist utopia. In between them, democracy tried to survive. Then came 1923. Hyperinflation. Money became a joke. People carried wages in wheelbarrows. Prices doubled between morning and evening. A lifetime of savings could barely buy a loaf of bread. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that everything you'd worked for had turned to dust. Not in a metaphorical sense, literally. Your currency is worthless. Your security is gone. When people lose money, they get angry. When they lose stability, they get desperate. That desperation is what truly started World War II. Because desperate people will listen to anyone who promises simple answers. And then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the American stock market crashed, dragging the world economy down with it. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. In Germany, 6 million people found themselves without work. Everywhere you looked, someone was waiting in a line. For food, for work, for hope. This is the soil in which Hitler grew. Not in glory. In despair. He was not just a politician. He was a storyteller. He told millions of wounded Germans what they desperately wanted to hear. Your suffering is not your fault. You did not lose the war. You were betrayed. By weak leaders, by communists, by Jews. I will restore your pride. I will make the world fear you again. That is one of the darkest truths behind World War II. It did not begin with weapons. It began with emotional hunger, for dignity, for revenge, for meaning. And Germany was not alone in this mood. In Italy, a frustrated veteran called Benito Mussolini watched his country spiral into chaos and declared democracy weak, slow, and useless. He promised to make Italy great again through discipline, obedience, and force. People believed him. In Japan, a proud empire with almost no natural resources struggled to feed its growing population. Its leaders, intoxicated with nationalism, saw conquest as survival. They looked at China, at Manchuria, at European colonies in Asia, and thought, if we do not expand, we will be left behind. 3 nations, 3 different cultures, same emotional pattern. Humiliation, fear of decline. A leader who turns frustration into aggression. And on the other side of this pressure cooker stood the League of Nations, a peacekeeper with no teeth, defending a peace built on resentment. The world was not at war yet, but philosophically, emotionally, morally, the next war had already begun. What truly started World War II was not just what the aggressors did. It was what everybody else chose not to do. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. They did it swiftly, almost casually, as if testing how far they could push. China protested. The League of Nations condemned. Japan simply ignored them, then walked out of the League. There were no sanctions that mattered, no united military response, no line in the sand. The lesson to all future aggressors was clear. If you move fast enough and look confident enough, the world will stay seated. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent African nations. Emperor Haile Selassie went to the League in person and begged the world for help. He did not receive armies. He received speeches. Italy used poison gas. The League used paperwork. Again, the message to the world was chilling. You can crush a weaker nation and still sit at the table of civilized powers. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler watched all of this like a patient gambler. Every time someone got away with something, his confidence grew. He rebuilt Germany's army in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. He created the Luftwaffe, a modern air force, when it was forbidden. He remilitarized the Rhineland, a border region that was supposed to stay free of troops. If France and Britain had marched in then, early on, many German generals later admitted they would have backed down. But no one moved. The trauma of World War I hung over every politician in London and Paris. They saw every decision through the memory of trenches, gas, and mass graves. Their fear of another war was so strong. They allowed the foundations of the next one to be built in front of them. Then came Spain. In 1936, Spain collapsed into civil war. Left-wing Republicans versus right-wing nationalists under Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini saw an opportunity, a perfect rehearsal for the next global conflict. They sent tanks, planes, and troops to help Franco. The Nazis tested bombing civilian targets in places like Guernica, turning a living town into rubble and ash. The world saw the photographs. Picasso painted the horror. Britain and France, chose non-intervention. They watched a rehearsal for World War II and treated it like someone else's tragedy. What started the war was not simply aggression. It was appeasement, the belief that if you keep feeding a wolf your neighbor's sheep, one day it will become full and lie down. But wolves do not stop because you surrender ground. They stop when you build a fence, or when they hit something that bites back. By the time the world realized it, the wolves were no longer at the edge of the forest. They were inside the village. By 1938, Hitler had become bolder. He no longer wanted to just break Versailles. He wanted to redraw the map of Europe. First, he took Austria. He called it a union of German brothers. There were crowds, flags, cheering. No shots fired. No resistance from abroad. Then he turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with many ethnic Germans. He stirred up unrest, then claimed he had to protect the German minority. Czechoslovakia was ready to fight. Its army was strong. Its defenses were solid. But its allies were tired and frightened. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler. Twice, Hitler promised that if he got the Sudetenland, he was done. No more demands. Chamberlain believed him, or chose to. At Munich, Britain and France agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland in exchange for that promise. Czechoslovakia wasn't even at the table. Chamberlain went home, holding a paper and saying, "Peace for our time." But peace built on lies is not peace. It is a pause. In March 1939, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia, including lands that were not German at all. No excuses, no ethnic justification, just power. The illusion was shattered. Even the most hopeful eyes could now see. This was not a man reclaiming lost territories. This was a man who wanted more, and more, and more. Britain and France, finally cornered by reality, drew a line. They promised to defend Poland if it was attacked, but Hitler had already prepared for that. In August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, his supposed mortal enemy. Behind closed doors, they agreed to carve up Poland and divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Morally, it was shocking. Strategically, it removed his last major obstacle. On the evening of August 31st, German troops waited at the Polish border. A fake Polish attack on a German radio station was staged as a pretext. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the fuse that had been burning for 2 decades finally hit the charge. German forces surged into Poland. This is the moment we point to and say, this is when World War II started. But you now know the truth. It started in empty kitchens in 1919, in broken currencies in 1923, in desperate crowds in 1930, in Manchuria, in Ethiopia, in Spain. In every moment, the world chose fear of conflict over the courage to stop it. What started World War II was not just Hitler, not just Germany. It was humiliation, economic despair, nationalism, cowardice, the failure of institutions, and the silence of those who could have spoken earlier. It was the perfect storm of human weakness. And that is why this story still matters. Because every generation faces its own version of humiliation, fear, economic crisis, and angry voices promising simple answers. The real question is not just, what started World War II? It's, would we recognize the warning signs if it began to happen again? If this spoke to you, don't leave without doing something small but powerful. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, which moment do you think was the real beginning of World War II? Because history doesn't just live in the past, it lives in the choices we make now.